We have our next guest. We're going to talk about the future of NATO, what that means, who potentially could lead it, and much, much more. Happy to welcome Roger Hilton, Defense Fellow at GlobeSec. Thanks so much for joining us here.
Thank you for joining.
Good evening.
So we are looking at 75 years of NATO. We have some changes, some new members. We have the Washington summit coming up in July. 75 years, around birthday. Does NATO, as it is right now, does it have reasons to celebrate?
I think there's no question, nobody wants to turn 75 years old, but on this occasion, NATO is really like a wine that's aging better with time. Over the course of its existence, the alliance has done so much, both during the Cold War and afterwards. And I think given the traumatic geopolitical situation right now, the fluid geopolitical dynamics, even more than ever, Europe and North America and the world to a certain degree really need NATO. So while it's time to celebrate, it's also time to stay at work in parallel.
All right, so we have reasons to celebrate. I'm just going to cut more into a little bit more depth here, because one of the elements we're kind of observing here is that NATO, as it expands, now 2 new members in the last months here, Nordic members, looking at conscription, that also seems to be something that has come back on the agenda in Europe. If I look around European nation states, I think currently the ones that have military conscription, compulsory service, it includes neutral countries like Austria and Switzerland, but the rest, if I'm looking, there are other 8 ones, Estonia, Denmark, Finland, Greece, Latvia, Lithuania, Norway, and Sweden, all have that conscription, many of them in the Nordics. Is this something that might become a bigger, let's say, not foundation, but a bigger NATO policy that will have and see more conscription return to NATO states?
I think it's a position for a lot of national governments to consider and examine, but given the low recruitment levels and the, let's say, unattractiveness of joining the military right now, I would caution governments about making wide sweeping policy changes and enacting it. You know, this concept of total defense and doing a lot more of weekend training, weekend warriors, and getting people more involved in military training, I think that's a good first step, because you can't assume bringing it back right away will be popular. And as we've learned from Ukraine, the #1 reason why people want to fight or want to join is there's a pride or there's a motivation. So getting your conscription papers and saying you have to go is not necessarily the best option. And as you can see with the desertion levels and sort of the lack of fighting spirit, the way Russia has done it, it's not necessarily the best policy option.
But at the same time, if I may, I mean, you're equating it with Russia. I mean, that's a completely different, I think, mindset. We've seen very much that. I think in many cases, as citizens, especially in the Nordics, they want to be part of NATO. They have that also, I think, sense of duty to join up, to be part of these weekend warriors, as you put it. So I think there is something to be said about weekend warriors as being part of a modern fighting force, potentially, more than, certainly in a different concept than the Russians. I just want to comment on that.
Yes, but I think the geopolitical situation as it's changing and as it's so dynamic, and we see that the NATO countries, especially here in Europe, have to kind of pull their weight, because they realize that there might be some changes coming from the US. If it comes to that, I suppose it's a good thing to think about. This is something to focus on. But let's have a look at a short soundbite from Jens Stoltenberg, so we can have a word about it with you together.
The Ukrainians are not running out of courage. They are running out of ammunition. We need to step up now to ensure our support is built to last. So in our meeting today, we discussed how to put our support on a firmer and more enduring basis for the future. All allies agree on the need to support Ukraine in this critical moment. There is a unity of purpose. Today, allies have agreed to move forward with planning for a greater NATO role in coordinating security assistance and training. The details will take shape in the weeks to come. But make no mistake, Ukraine can rely on NATO support now and for the long haul.
Right, so there we have noble words there from the Secretary General there, Mr. Stoltenberg. When you hear that, and based on what was said today and his proposal for that fund as well, how do you see that working out in the long term, in the medium term? Will that fund see the light of day? Is that commitment, that unity as strong as he says it is?
Well, I think it's really a sign by NATO of the strategic foresight, building in as many backup options given sort of the unpredictability of what might occur in the United States. And I think, going back to our number one theme about this being NATO's 75th birthday, this is just another sort of phase of maturity, where NATO was not necessarily at the forefront in terms of coordinating the Ramstein format. And now this is a great sign for Europe's security, not just for NATO, but for the EU, if NATO was to sort of take over a much more prominent and primary role in this coordination process. I think there's a lot of work to be done on the legislative side and hammering it out in paper. But, you've had a huge change in perception with somebody like President Emmanuel Macron, which is a major shift in sort of the strategic culture of Europe. So I don't want to get ahead of it right now, and there's a lot of work to be done, but it's definitely the right idea that they should be doing looking forward as, there's no reason to believe that this war will be ending anytime soon.
But why is that shift? I would like to take a moment to take a look at some of the leaders, for example, Emmanuel Macron, the French president. Why do you think that shift is taking place? What was the factor behind it that really pushed him in that direction?
Well, regardless of your position on it, if you thought it was good that he was trying to negotiate with Vladimir Putin, as he launched this barbaric attack, I think he's just reached the end of his cord and realized that this just wasn't a feasible option anymore. And he's made the realization that now, in addition to sort of the hard conflict that's going on in Ukraine, Russia poses a massive threat to Europe, in soft security and sub-threshold issues in the future. You have the Paris Olympics coming up, and I think there's just an overwhelming amount of evidence to suggest now that was irrefutable for President Macron that said, okay, listen, there's really no ideological compromise left. Putin has gone all in, so it's really time to sort of change our perception and step it up. And in this Gallic tradition of wanting to lead Europe, I think it fits Macron's profile quite well.
I want to jump in on another quote that we have. I want to share with you and just get your view on it. Basically also from Secretary General Stoltenberg. I'm quoting here, "We must ensure reliable and predictable security assistance to Ukraine for the long haul. So we rely less on voluntary contributions, more on NATO commitments, less on short-term offers, and more on multi-year pledges." Can we, in that sense, from one optics, I'm kind of reading that, I'm thinking, wait, is this a sort of way that we might institutionalize that 2% marker of defense spending? Could that also lead in this direction, possibly? What do you think?
It's definitely an option moving forward, but I think sort of the long-term picture where you've had Ukraine sign long-term contracts with France and Germany, I think that's the trend moving forward that they want to do about providing more regular equipment. And there's been so much negative press about Europe not being able to step up and defend. And, I'm of the position that it just needs a little bit more time to build the strategic culture. A lot of member states have already sort of been revamping their industrial policy. So I think gradually over time, there's been so many lessons learned for European leaders. So I think whether it's institutionalized or not, I think in general, the European continent, both for the EU and for NATO, it's going to be in a much better position in about a year to not only defend itself, but to be providing more regular, reliable support for Ukraine. But it comes at the expense that the ultimate price is being paid by Ukrainian defenders holding the front line at the moment.
So as we have this talk of NATO, of NATO's past and possibly NATO's future, I'm wondering if this meeting today, do you think that this meeting today was the moment when the European members of NATO came together and they came up with something concrete ahead of the Washington summit to take place in July?
I think if history has taught us anything, and sort of been following NATO for 10 years as a Canadian in Europe, there's always a brand new milestone. This is definitely something that people will remember or revert back to in policy papers or in, all of the conferences that are going on long term. But this is just one step, I think, that Europe and the European members of NATO need to take. And I really look at it holistically that, NATO doesn't just need to tackle Russia. That might be the pacing threat at the moment. But, whether it's all of the different issues going on in Asia, climate change, biosecurity, I think sort of the idea that Europe needs to stand up more for itself globally and project its power is something that, again, is going to take a little bit longer to develop. They're definitely making the right steps, and all I can caution for the moment is that they're just not complacent. And should there be Ukraine emerge victorious, or there is sort of a negotiated peace settlement on Kiev's terms, they have to keep their foot on the pedal and keep going, because the issues that are happening in Europe is just one of many that are emerging, as well as multiple black swan events that are likely going to occur, as we saw with the pandemic and with climate change.
Yeah, indeed. And I think you've touched on a lot of security issues there that span not just the North Atlantic, but also the world. So I'm sure we'll have more NATO rather than less of it. We'll have to conclude it there. Roger Hilton, thank you so much. Defense fellow GlobeSec, thanks for your time today.
Thank you so much.
Dobry wieczór. Thank you.
Thank you.